The wind that night didn't just blow through the Ardennes, it scraped. It was December of 1944, and the snow wasn't falling in gentle, picturesque flakes. It was coming down hard, horizontal, driven by a gale that made every breath feel like swallowing crushed glass. In a tiny, battered supply depot tucked away in a half-ruined stone bar near Bastogne, a handful of men were freezing to death. They had no coal, no hot food, and wool coats that had turned to ice. But as the double doors of the barn creaked open, throwing a blinding shaft of lantern light across the drifts, the quartermaster didn't bring them blankets, wool trousers, or heavy overcoats. Master Sergeant Arthur Vance hauled 3 heavy wooden crates off the back of a flatbed truck, dropped them onto the frozen dirt floor, and pried the lids open with a crowbar. Inside, fresh, crisp, and completely surreal, were thousands of lightweight, light tan cotton summer tropical uniforms. Short-sleeved shirts, thin trousers, and sun helmet liners meant for the Pacific Theater. The men looked at the cotton, then at the snow howling outside, and then at Vance. Nobody laughed. It was too cold to laugh. But before any man could scream, before the quiet desperation in that barn turned into a mutiny against a quartermaster who seemed to have finally lost his mind, the ground beneath their boots began to vibrate. Low, rhythmic, and unmistakable, the roar of massive diesel engines broke through the storm. General George S. Patton's Third Army was rolling in early, and Arthur Vance's mad gesture was about to reveal a secret that would either save every frozen soul in that valley or get him court-martialed before sunrise. Arthur Vance wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was 38 years old, with eyes that looked like they had seen every inventory sheet in the Western Hemisphere and a mustache trimmed with obsessive precision. Before the war, Arthur had managed a hardware supply line in Ohio. He understood logistics the way a composer understands music. To Arthur, war wasn't fought with bravado. It was fought with supply manifests, crate numbers, and lead time. When the men of the 101st Airborne and surrounding support elements found themselves encircled in the bitter cold, Arthur was the man responsible for keeping them alive out of a tiny forward supply depot. But logistics break down when the world turns to ice. Supply lines were cut, trucks were ambushed, and the airdrops were failing because the fog was as thick as wall plaster. The men were wrapping their feet in burlap sacks and tearing down church pews just to keep a small fire going long enough to thaw their sea rations. Among those men was Private First Class Daniel Brooks, a 19-year-old kid from Indiana who had never seen real snow before he arrived in France. Daniel's boots had split open 3 days ago. His toes had gone from red to purple, and now he couldn't feel them at all. He sat in the corner of the barn, shivering so violently his teeth rattled like dice in a cup, watching Arthur pry open those crate lids. When Daniel saw the thin, khaki summer fabric, tears of sheer frustration welled in his eyes. He stumbled forward, leaning against a wooden post for support. He asked Arthur if this was some kind of sick joke, if the high command had forgotten that Europe was freezing, or if they just didn't care about them anymore. Arthur didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just looked at Daniel with cold, steady eyes, handed him a pair of thin, khaki trousers, and told him to start distributing them to every man in the perimeter immediately, and to make sure every soldier wore them over their threadbare wool trousers. The men thought Arthur had snapped under the pressure of the siege. Rumors spread like wildfire through the freezing foxholes around the depot. They said the quartermaster had lost his marbles, that he was handing out sun clothing to men who were 48 hours away from losing their limbs to frostbite. Corporal Thomas, a hardened veteran who had fought through Italy, grabbed Arthur by the collar right there in the dim lantern light. He pointed out into the blizzard, screaming over the sound of the wind, asking how a summer shirt was supposed to stop a German bullet or keep a man from freezing to death in a ditch. Arthur pulled Thomas's hand off his coat, his expression unreadable. He told Thomas that if he wanted to live to see the sunrise, he would do exactly as he was ordered, put the khaki gear on over his clothes, and ask questions when shooting stopped. What nobody knew was that Arthur had intercepted a garbled radio transmission 4 hours earlier, a message that wasn't meant for his ears. The central supply depot at Reims had misrouted 3 supply trains. A shipment meant for North African garrisons had been sent to France by mistake, while the winter gear meant for the Ardennes was sitting in a rail yard 300 miles away in the wrong direction. But Arthur hadn't just received a mistake. He had noticed something else in the shipping manifests. The summer uniforms weren't just cotton. They were heavy-grade tropical twill, densely woven, and coated with a temporary oil-based water repellent designed for monsoon seasons in the South Pacific. More importantly, Arthur knew something about thermal insulation that the combat grunts didn't. In extreme cold, trapped air between layers is what saves a life, not just the thickness of a single heavy garment. But there was a darker, far more dangerous reason Arthur was forcing them into those bright, light tan uniforms in the middle of a snow-covered forest. As night fell deeper, the storm intensified. The temperature dropped to 5 below zero. Out in the forward foxholes, the soldiers reluctantly pulled the oversized khaki shirts and trousers over their ruined winter gear. It looked absurd. A group of American soldiers clad in desert tan, standing out like dark splotches against the blinding white landscape. Daniel Brooks crept back out to his listening post, cursing Arthur under his breath. But within an hour, something strange began to happen. The densely woven tropical twill blocked the biting wind in a way their worn, porous wool coats never had. By trapping a layer of air between the wool and the heavy, oil-treated cotton, their body heat stopped escaping into the gale. The shaking in Daniel's chest began to subside. It wasn't warm, yet the danger was far from over. The bright khaki made them walking targets against the snow. If the enemy launched an attack, the men would be picked off like ducks in a gallery. Corporal Thomas scrambled back into the barn, demanding answers. He told Arthur that even if the clothes kept the wind out, they were practically painting a bullseye on every soldier's chest. Arthur was standing over a detailed map of the sector, a single candle illuminating his tired face. He looked at Thomas and finally confessed part of the truth. He knew the khaki was visible. In fact, he was counting on it. 2 hours before the convoy arrived, Arthur had scouted the eastern perimeter alone. He had seen fresh tank tracks in the snow, heavy Panther tanks creeping through the treeline, positioning themselves for a dawn ambush on the main road leading into Bastogne. The German forces in the sector were low on fuel and ammunition, waiting for the American supply lines to collapse completely before moving in for the kill. Arthur knew that if the Americans looked like a defeated, freezing remnant, the enemy would sweep through the depot without hesitation. But seeing a fully equipped, uniquely outfitted unit operating with strange, uniform discipline in the middle of a blizzard would make the enemy command pause, suspecting a specialized winter warfare counter-offensive unit had been brought up from the reserves. Arthur was playing a game of psychological poker with an entire German battalion, using summer clothes as a bluff to buy time. But the bluff was about to collapse under its own weight. At midnight, the sound of mortar shells began to walk down the valley. The enemy was probing the lines. Shrapnel tore through the wooden roof of the barn, showering the supply depot in sparks and splinters. One of the shells landed directly near the fuel cache, blowing open a crater and setting fire to a truck. In the glare of the orange flames, the khaki-clad soldiers ran to form a defensive line. Through the smoke and flying snow, the sight of scores of men dressed in light tan uniforms charging through the blizzard looked completely uncanny. From across the field, the German forward observers hesitated. Over the radio, the German officers began arguing about what they were looking at, delaying their armored assault by crucial, agonizing minutes as they tried to identify the strange American brigade holding the crossroad. In the middle of the chaotic skirmish, Daniel Brooks was hit by shrapnel in the thigh. He collapsed into a snowdrift, the snow instantly soaking through his khaki trousers. The blood began to spread, dark and hot against the light fabric. Out in the open field, with machine gun fire cracking over the snow, Daniel couldn't move. He watched through blurred vision as a figure emerged from the smoke, crouched low, running straight into the line of fire. It was Arthur. The quartermaster wasn't wearing a helmet. His pencil mustache was dusted with frost. He grabbed Daniel by the webbing of his vest and dragged him backward through the snow, inch by inch, using his own body to shield the young soldier from the spraying bullets. When they finally tumbled into the shelter of a ruined stone wall, Daniel looked up at the older man, gasping for air. Daniel asked him why a quartermaster, a man who belonged behind a desk pushing papers, was risking his life out in the cold for a bunch of nameless privates. Arthur looked at the kid, his breath coming in heavy white clouds. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, faded black and white photograph of a young boy no older than Daniel, dressed in a high school football uniform. Arthur whispered that 5 years ago, he had lost his only son to a sudden illness because he hadn't noticed the signs early enough. He had spent every day since trying to make up for a moment of helplessness he could never undo. He told Daniel that his job wasn't to manage crates or sign manifests. His job was to bring every single one of these boys home, even if he had to break every rule in the War Department to do it. The relief Arthur was waiting for wasn't just any unit. Days earlier, General George S. Patton had made a legendary promise to the Allied High Command. He would turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of a dead of winter battle and march over 100 miles north to relieve the besieged forces at Bastogne. Most generals thought it was impossible. The weather was too severe, the roads were ice rinks, and the logistics were a nightmare. But Patton was a man who pushed his men past the absolute limit of human endurance. In that night, the impossible was barreling down the narrow forest roads straight toward Arthur's little battered depot. The roar of engines grew deafening. The ground shook so hard that snow fell in sheets from the branches of the pine trees. Out of the darkness, the massive steel silhouettes of Sherman tanks tore through the tree-line, their searchlights cutting through the falling snow like swords of light. The Third Army had arrived, hours ahead of schedule, led by the vanguard of the 4th Armored Division. The German forces, caught off guard and confused by the strange defense at the crossroad, were forced into a chaotic retreat as the armored columns swept the perimeter clear with high explosive shells and heavy machine gun fire. As the battle settled into a tense silence, a heavy Dodge command car roared up to the front of the ruined stone barn, its tires chained against the slick ice. The door opened, and out stepped General George S. Patton himself, wrapped in his iconic long trench coat, brass buttons gleaming even in the dull gloom, his ivory-handled pistols strapped to his hips. He surveyed the scene with sharp, fierce eyes, the burning truck, the dead enemy positions, and the group of ragged, frozen soldiers standing at attention in the snow, every single one of them wearing light tan summer tropical uniforms over their gear. Patton walked slowly toward Arthur Vance, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen crust. He looked Arthur up and down, his face stern, his brow furrowed in utter disbelief. Patton demanded to know what kind of circus Arthur was running in this sector, and why his soldiers were dressed for a beach vacation in Hawaii while standing in 5 inches of Belgian ice. The surrounding officers held their breath. A single word from Patton could lead to an immediate court-martial for insubordination and destruction of military discipline. Arthur stepped forward, stood at rigid attention, saluted, and presented the ledger he had kept throughout the night. He explained the math to the general without a single tremor in his voice. He detailed how the trapped air between the dense tropical twill and the wool had prevented severe frostbite in 84 men who would have otherwise lost their limbs. He showed how the strange uniforms had confused the enemy's reconnaissance, causing them to delay their armored attack for 3 hours. The exact 3 hours Patton's Third Army needed to reach the sector before the road to Bastogne was completely cut off. Patton snatched the ledger from Arthur's hands, reading through the crisp, precise notes written in pencil by a man who treated war as a science of survival. The general looked up from the paper, then looked at Private Daniel Brooks, who was being loaded onto a medical stretcher, his foot saved, his life intact, wearing the light khaki pants stained with soot and blood. Patton walked over to Daniel, looked down at the young soldier, and asked him how he felt. Daniel looked the legendary general in the eye and said that it was the warmest winter he had ever felt. A rare, faint smile touched Patton's lips. He turned back to Arthur Vance, walked up to the master sergeant, and did something nobody expected. He reached out, grabbed Arthur's hand, and shook it firmly. Patton declared that a good commander knows how to win a battle with weapons, but a great quartermaster knows how to save lives with whatever God puts in his hands. He ordered that Arthur be commended on the spot, and that every man in the sector receive a double ration of hot coffee and fresh wool gear from the Third Army's primary supply trucks immediately. As the sun began to rise over the Ardennes, casting a soft, golden light over the snow-covered battlefield, the storm finally subsided. The white landscape was calm, broken only by the deep tracks of tanks and the footprints of men who had survived against all odds. Arthur stood outside the barn, watching the trucks carry the wounded to the rear. The summer uniforms, absurd as they had seemed in the dark of midnight, had saved an entire company from freezing into oblivion. Sometimes, leadership isn't about grand speeches or heroic charges into enemy fire. Sometimes, it's about a quiet man standing in a cold barn, looking at a crate of the wrong supplies, and having the wisdom and courage to turn a mistake into a miracle. In the middle of the coldest winter Europe had ever seen, it wasn't the sun that brought warmth back to those men. It was the fierce, unwavering devotion of a man who refused to let them die.